The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 13-year-old Melody Chen stood at the Family Feud podium, with her hand instinctively touching the small scar on her throat where surgeons had worked to save her life 2 years earlier, her mouth opening and closing silently for a moment before the barest whisper emerged, a sound so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick up her words. When Steve Harvey asked about something you miss more than anything, Melody's response, delivered in the fragile whisper that had replaced the powerful singing voice that had once defined her entire identity, would reveal what it means to lose the very thing that made you feel most alive, most yourself, most connected to the world around you. Singing, Melody had whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 2 years spent mourning, not just the loss of her voice, but the loss of who she had been before cancer had stolen. The one thing that had made her feel like herself. I used to sing all the time. Everyone said I had a gift. Now I can barely speak loud enough for people to hear me. The studio had fallen into a respectful silence as everyone present strained to hear her words and began to understand that they were witnessing someone whose fundamental means of expression and identity had been taken away by the very treatments that had saved her life, creating a heartbreaking paradox where survival had come at the cost of the thing that had made life most meaningful. Melody Chen had been diagnosed with laryngeal papillomatosis, a rare condition caused by the human papillomavirus, HPV, that creates benign tumors in the throat and vocal cords, when she was 11 years old. For most of her childhood, Melody had been known as the singer, the child with the extraordinary voice who had performed solos in school concerts, had won local talent competitions, and had been planning a future built around the musical gift that had defined her identity since she was old enough to carry a tune. The diagnosis had come after months of voice changes that her family had initially attributed to normal pre-adolescent development. Melody's voice had become increasingly hoarse and strained, she had developed a persistent cough, and she had begun experiencing difficulty breathing that had gradually worsened over time. When these symptoms had interfered with her ability to sing and perform, her parents, David and Susan Chen, had sought medical evaluation that had revealed the devastating reality of her condition. Laryngeal papillomatosis is a serious condition that can be life-threatening if the tumors grow large enough to block the airway completely. In Melody's case, the papillomas had grown aggressively and had required immediate surgical intervention to prevent complete airway obstruction. Over the course of 18 months, she had undergone 7 surgical procedures to remove tumors that kept recurring despite treatment. Each surgery had been necessary to keep Melody breathing, but each procedure had also caused additional damage to her vocal cords and surrounding tissues. The delicate structures that had once produced her beautiful singing voice had been repeatedly traumatized by the surgical removal of tumors, creating scar tissue and permanent changes that had progressively destroyed her ability to produce the clear, strong sounds that had once come so effortlessly. The most devastating surgery had been the one that had finally achieved tumor-free status, but had required extensive removal of vocal cord tissue that could never be repaired or replaced. When Melody had awakened from that final procedure, her doctors had explained that while they had successfully eliminated the papillomas, her voice would never recover to its previous quality or strength. The immediate aftermath of losing her voice had been traumatic and disorienting for Melody. She had spent weeks learning to communicate through whispers, written notes and gestures while her throat healed from surgery. But more challenging than the physical recovery had been the psychological impact of losing the ability to do the thing that had defined her sense of self and her place in the world. For 11 years, Melody had been the child who could sing beautifully, who was called upon to perform at family gatherings and school events, who had found joy and identity in creating music that moved people and expressed emotions that words alone couldn't capture. The loss of her singing voice had felt like losing a fundamental part of her personality, her purpose, and her connection to others. The social impact of Melody's voice loss had been profound and isolating. Friends who had known her primarily as a performer had struggled to relate to her in her new reality. Teachers had stopped asking her to participate in musical activities that had once been central to her school experience, and family members had found themselves avoiding topics related to music or singing because they didn't want to remind her of what she had lost. Melody had attempted to continue participating in musical activities through other means, playing instruments, writing songs, helping with sound equipment, but these alternatives had felt hollow and painful rather than fulfilling. Being around music and unable to participate fully had been a constant reminder of her loss rather than a source of comfort or connection. The identity crisis that had accompanied Melody's voice loss had been particularly challenging during early adolescence, when questions of self-definition and peer acceptance were already complex and emotionally charged. She had been forced to discover who she was beyond her musical abilities, to find new sources of confidence and self-worth, and to navigate social relationships without the talent that had previously made her special and memorable to others. Melody's family had struggled to support her through this transition while managing their own grief about the loss of her musical future. David and Susan had watched their daughter's personality change from outgoing and confident to withdrawn and uncertain, had seen her lose interest in activities that had once brought her joy, and had felt helpless to restore the sense of purpose and identity that had been so central to who she had been. The medical team that had treated Melody's papillomatosis had been excellent at addressing the life-threatening aspects of her condition, but they had been less prepared to help her and her family cope with the psychological and social consequences of voice loss. While they had saved her life, they had been unable to preserve the quality of life that had been built around her musical abilities. Melody had worked with speech therapists to maximize what vocal function remained and to develop techniques for communicating more effectively with her damaged voice. But these interventions, while helpful for basic communication, could not restore the singing ability that had been central to her identity and dreams for the future. The grief that Melody experienced was complex and ongoing, involving not just the loss of her current abilities, but the loss of future possibilities that had been built around her musical talents. She had grieved for the high school musical performances she would never give, the recording opportunities that would never come, the career in music that would never be possible, and the simple joy of singing along to songs that had once brought her happiness. Music itself had become a source of pain rather than pleasure for Melody. Hearing songs that she had once loved to sing, watching other people perform with the ease that had once been natural to her, and being in environments where music was prominent had all become emotional triggers that reminded her of what she had lost. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Susan Chen, who had hoped that participating in a fun family activity might help Melody regain some confidence and joy that wasn't related to music or performance. She had thought that succeeding in a different type of activity might help Melody begin to see that she had value and abilities beyond singing, and that her family's love and pride in her extended far beyond her vocal talents. During the pre-show preparations, Melody had been excited but anxious about speaking on television with her damaged voice. The production team had been patient and accommodating, adjusting microphone levels and speaking patterns to ensure that her whispered responses could be heard by the audience. But the experience had also highlighted for Melody how much her communication abilities had been affected by her voice loss. The game had been proceeding with Melody participating as much as her voice allowed, but clearly struggling with the energy and vocal demands of the competitive environment. The Chen family was competing against the Rodriguez family from Arizona, and while both sides had been playing enthusiastically, there was something poignant about watching Melody try to engage fully while managing the limitations imposed by her damaged voice. But when it came time for the category, something you miss more than anything, and it was Melody's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of her loss and the identity crisis that had defined the past 2 years of her life. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Melody's small stature, the scar on her throat, and the obvious effort required for her to speak had made him immediately more gentle and attentive than usual. "All right, Melody," Steve had said softly, leaning closer to ensure he could hear her response. "Something you miss more than anything. What comes to mind?" Melody had touched her throat unconsciously, taken a careful breath, and whispered her response with all the volume she could manage. "Singing," Melody had whispered, the word carrying 2 years of grief and longing. "I used to sing all the time. Everyone said I had a gift. Now I can barely speak loud enough for people to hear me." The studio had become completely quiet as everyone present understood that they were witnessing a child whose fundamental means of expression and source of identity had been taken away by the medical treatments that had saved her life. Steve had paused, clearly moved by the tragedy and complexity of Melody's situation. "Melody," Steve had said gently, "can you tell me what singing meant to you?" "It was everything," Melody had whispered, tears beginning to form as she spoke about her loss. "It was how I talked to God, how I made friends, how I felt happy. When I sang, I felt like myself. Now I don't know who I am." The studio audience had listened with obvious emotion as they began to understand the depth of identity loss that accompanied the loss of a defining talent or ability. "What happened to your voice?" Steve had asked with obvious compassion. "I had tumors in my throat," Melody had explained in her whisper. "They had to do surgery to save my life, but it damaged my vocal cords. The doctors said I'll never sing again." Steve had looked at David and Susan Chen, who were clearly emotional, as they listened to their daughter describe her loss and identity struggle. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," Steve had said, "how has this affected your family?" "It's been heartbreaking," Susan had said through tears. "Melody was such a joyful child when she could sing. Watching her lose that gift and struggle to find herself again has been one of the hardest things we've ever experienced as parents." David had nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "She's still the same wonderful person she always was," David had said, "but she can't see that anymore. She thinks her voice was the only thing that made her special." Steve had looked at Melody with deep understanding and respect. "Melody," Steve had said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. Your voice was a gift, but it wasn't the only gift you have. Music doesn't just come from vocal cords. It comes from the heart, from the soul, from the part of you that understands beauty and wants to share it with the world." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required both acknowledgement of Melody's profound loss and affirmation of her continuing worth and potential. "Melody," Steve had said, placing the jacket gently around her small shoulders, "this jacket represents something very important today. It represents the understanding that you are so much more than your singing voice. You have music in your heart that can be expressed in many different ways, and losing your voice doesn't mean losing your gift for touching people's lives." Melody had pulled the oversized jacket closer, clearly moved by Steve's words and the recognition that her identity could extend beyond her vocal abilities. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Melody Chen is teaching us something beautiful about identity, loss, and the many ways that gifts can be shared. She's showing us that losing one ability doesn't mean losing all purpose, and that the music in someone's heart can find new ways to reach the world." The game had resumed with increased warmth and celebration, as everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just someone who had lost something precious, but someone who was learning to discover new forms of value and expression. When Steve had asked the final question about things that make you special, Melody had whispered, "Learning that I'm more than just my voice, and finding new ways to make music." The episode aired 4 months later, and became a powerful story about resilience, identity, and the many ways that people can find meaning and expression after losing abilities that had defined them. Music therapy organizations and medical support groups used Melody's story to help other young people navigate identity changes following medical treatments. Melody had kept Steve's jacket, which had been tailored to fit her properly, as a symbol of the moment when she began to understand that her worth extended beyond her singing voice. More importantly, she had begun exploring songwriting, music production, and other ways of creating and sharing music that didn't require the vocal abilities she had lost. The jacket represented her understanding that identity can be rebuilt after loss, that gifts can be expressed in multiple ways, and that the music in someone's heart is stronger than any physical limitation that might try to silence it. Because that's what courage looks like when it faces the loss of a defining ability and chooses to find new forms of expression. That's what resilience sounds like when it discovers that identity is bigger than any single talent. And that's what happens when a 13-year-old girl learns that losing her voice doesn't mean losing her music, and that the heart can sing in ways that transcend sound. Melody Chen had lost her singing voice to cancer, but on that day at Family Feud, she discovered that her musical spirit was unbreakable, that her worth extended far beyond any single ability, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned to sing in silence.